Good afternoon in the West Coast, good evening in Central Time, and good evening in the Eastern time zone. I'm Professor Barlow Dermogradician of the Armenian Studies program, and I'd like to welcome all of you to a special presentation on Bedros Keljik's Armenian-American sketches, stories of Armenians in the early 20th century. Today's webinar was organized by the Armenian Studies program at Fresno State, but is co-sponsored by the National Association for Armenian Studies and Research, NAASR, and the Armenian Cultural Organization of Minnesota, ACOM, and the Society for Armenian Studies, SAS. Today, I'm going to introduce our moderator, and he is Marc Mamigonian, and he is the Director of Academic Affairs for the National Association for Armenian Studies and Research. He will be introducing each of our guests as they speak. And at the end of today's presentation, there will be an opportunity for our listeners to ask questions and to interact with our speakers. So I'd like to introduce Marc Mamigonian to be our moderator for today's program. Marc?
Thanks, Barlow. I want to thank also all of the co-sponsoring organizations and to point out to everybody who's listening, either live or later online, that all these organizations deserve and depend on your support. So I would encourage you to, if you are enjoying this event, to go to the websites of these respective and respected organizations and consider becoming a member or supporting them through your financial contributions or learning more about the organizations. These programs are coming to you through the miracle of the internet, and you can find the organizations by the same means. There are several reasons why I'm very excited about today's program and its subject matter. And I'm aware very much of my privilege in being allowed to introduce and moderate it. First, our book that we're going to hear about today, Bedros Keljik's Armenian-American Sketches, is a great example of the translation of a work of Armenian literature, a work written in the Armenian language, into English, thus making it accessible to an entirely new readership, while at the same time, one hopes, also calling attention to the work for those who can read Armenian, but who might otherwise be unaware of the book or its author. Such work of translation is of great importance, not because reading it in English rather than in its original language is better than or a substitute for reading it in Armenian, but because it is a fact that those of us who do not read all the languages of the world must experience a great deal of the world's great literature through translations. Second, Keljiks' work, while literary rather than historiographical, provides us with a window on early Armenian-American life in a way that is different from works of history. And these are not romanticized portraits that we get in Armenian-American sketches. Many of the characters are cunning, maybe a little crooked. Some are honest, and others are too naive, maybe, for their own good. In his preface, Keljik declared that, quote, he fulfilled a moral obligation, one which my teacher, the late Tulkadinsi, placed upon me and my friends. Observe our surroundings before looking afar. Tulkadinsi expected us to maintain the Armenian literary tradition and to give a realistic depiction of Armenian life even in a foreign environment, no matter where we were, unquote. Tulkadinsi was a great Armenian regional writer from Kharpert and an educator, and he was the teacher of Bedros Keljik and a good number of other important Armenian authors. In this, I find much in common between Keljik and James Joyce, perhaps inevitably. Not so much the Joyce of Ulysses or Finnegan's Wake, but of Dubliners, although they are actually all the same James Joyce. In 1905, when Joyce was trying to get a publisher for Dubliners, a process that would take most of a decade, Joyce wrote to a prospective publisher, quote, I do not think that any writer has yet presented Dublin to the world, and I think people might be willing to pay for the special odor of corruption, which I hope floats over my stories. To the same publisher, he later wrote that, quote, my intention was to write a chapter of the moral history of my country, and I believe that in composing my chapter of moral history in exactly the way I have composed it, I have taken the first step towards the spiritual liberation of my country. Finally, he declares, perhaps only slightly ironically, that, quote, I seriously believe that you will retard the course of civilization in Ireland by preventing the Irish people from having one good look at themselves in my nicely polished looking glass. The publisher declined. But this sort of looking glass is precisely what Bedros Keljik has held up to his fellow Armenian-Americans in writing Armenian-American sketches. Furthermore, and lastly, there are precious few works of any kind, literary, historiographical, or otherwise, on what I would like to call the Paleolithic era of the Armenian-American community, the late 1800s and very early 1900s, before the genocide remade Armenian existence everywhere. We have wonderful books such as Robert Myrach's great Torn Between Two Lands, Martin Duranian's Worcester is America, Berge Bulbulian's The Fresno Armenians. But for the most part, we still know little about Armenian-American life in those years. My earliest direct ancestor, one great-grandfather, emigrated to America in 1888, just before his fellow Harpatsi, Bedros Keljik. 1888 is 132 years ago. It is closer to the birth of the Republic than it is to this unfortunate year of 2020. Armenians, in short, have lived here for a good chunk of America's history. And yet the study of Armenian-American history and culture lags big time, and it is impossible not to recognize what Christopher Atamian, from whom we will hear soon, what Christopher Atamian writes in the preface to the book. He refers to, quote, the puzzling indifference of the Armenian-American community to its own rich culture, unquote. It is indeed rich, and it is indeed puzzling. Perhaps we can discuss this more later, but now it is time to introduce our speakers, each of whom has a long and impressive resume of accomplishments, only some of which can be mentioned here. In the order in which they will speak, they are Dr. Luannematosian, a co-editor of Armenian-American sketches, who has long been active in Armenian affairs in many respects. She has served as the founding program director of the Kafestian Family Foundation, as Eastern U.S. Director of the Armenian Reporter, Director of Development of the Armenian Diocese of the Armenian Church, the Eastern Diocese of the Armenian Church of America, and she has led the Armenian Cultural Organization of Minnesota, which is co-sponsoring tonight's program, as well as served on the board of NAASR, in addition to her work as a writer and researcher, including the first English translation of one of Bedros Keljik's stories. And it is difficult for me to even say this, but it has now been 10 years since she gave a fabulous presentation on Bedros Keljik at NAASR, from Massachusetts to Minnesota, pioneering Armenian-American writer Bedros Keljik. Our second speaker, Christopher Atamian, is a writer, translator, and director and creative producer who has written, translated, and edited 6 books to date, including the poetry volume A Poet in Washington Heights, which won the 2017 Minas Tololian Literary Award, and translations of Krikor Beledian's 50 Years of Armenian Literature in France and Nigoros Sarafian's Bois de Vincent, the latter of which also won the Tololian Literary Award. He contributes critical pieces to leading publications such as the New York Times Book Review and the Huffington Post, while working on other creative endeavors in film and theater. He is the co-editor of Keljik's Armenian-American sketches. The third speaker, Dr. Vartan Matiossian, is the executive director of the Armenian Prelacy of the Armenian Church, the Eastern Prelacy of the Armenian Church, and previously he has served as the director of the Armenian National Education Committee at the Prelacy. He also serves as the book review editor at the Armenian Review and is a historian, literary scholar, translator, and educator who has published 6 books on Armenian history and literature in Armenian and Spanish, as well as articles in Armenian, Spanish, and English. He contributed 8 translations of pieces by Bedros Keljik for the current volume, and I speak from experience in saying he is an invaluable source of information and insight on nearly all things Armenian. And finally, Professor Barlow Dermogradician, whom we've already heard from, is the Barbarian Coordinator of the Armenian Studies Program and the Director of the Center for Armenian Studies at California State University, Fresno. He serves as the editor of the Armenian series at the press at CSU Fresno, which was responsible for the publication of Keljik's Armenian-American sketches. His involvement in Armenian studies is too voluminous to catalog here, but if there's something happening in Armenian studies, there's a very good chance that Barlow is connected with it. Let me point out a couple of things here. One is that the book, Armenian-American Sketches is available from the NAASR bookstore, which is online at www.naasr.org, naasr.org, and I'm sure other fine outlets of book selling. And I would ask you all to please remember to use the Q&A function, and we will take as many questions as we can at the end of the program. So I will now hand things over to Dr. Luannematosian with great pleasure.
Thank you so much. All right, I'm going to share my screen here. And let me know if you can see introduction.
Looks good.
Yeah, you can see it. Great. Well, thank you so much for that very kind introduction, Mark. And yes, and it was 10 years ago. It's really hard to believe. So anyway, welcome all of you. And my role here is going to be to introduce not only the book, but also Bedros Keljik, because although Bedros Keljik is well known to Minnesota Armenians, he was the first Armenian to settle in our state. He is less well known to the Armenian world. And so that is going to be my subject right here. So without further ado, here is Bedros. Okay, Bedros Keljik, author, activist, and entrepreneur Bedros Keljik belongs to the founding generation of Armenian-American authors. But his short stories about early Armenian immigrant life are only now emerging from obscurity. Born in the city of Harpert, also known as Harput, in historic Western Armenia, Keljik was deeply influenced by his teacher and school principal, the Armenian provincial realist Tilgadinsi. Keljik was not the only writer in the family. He was also a maternal uncle of Vahan Totovents, author of Life on the Old Roman Road and other works. And he was an elder brother of novelist and poet Krikor Keljik of St. Paul. Both of those, Vahan Totovents and Krikor Keljik, also studied under Tilgadinsi. After emigrating to the United States in 1890 at age 16, Keljik worked for 2 years in factories in Worcester and Fitchburg, Massachusetts, then moved to Boston, where he became known as a fiery orator for the Hunchak Party. Through his involvement in Armenian literary circles, he also translated Armenian poems with human rights activist Alice Stone Blackwell. And during the Hamidian massacres of the mid-1890s, these poems were published in book form to draw Americans' attention to the Armenian cause. After the presidential election of 1896, Keljik moved to Chicago, where he sold Oriental rugs in a department store, campaigned for the Democratic Party, and somehow found the time to graduate from Kent College of Law. In November 1899, Keljik arrived in St. Paul, Minnesota, becoming the first Armenian to settle permanently in that state, and started a family Oriental rug business now in its 3rd generation. Bedros and his wife, Zabel Kirtikian, originally from Constantinople, had 2 sons, Woodrow and Emerson, and a daughter, Suzanne. Emerson was the one to take over the family business and eventually passed it on to Bedros's grandson, Marc Keljik. And it was Marc Keljik who first discovered that his grandfather had written a book. Amazing. So here's the story. While visiting Washington, D.C., Marc Keljik had a free afternoon at the Library of Congress. So he typed his last name into the computer, into the card catalog, just to see what might come up. And to his surprise, he said, I found that my grandfather had written a book. So Marc and I borrowed a copy from the Cleveland Public Library, and in 1997, Ararat Quarterly published my translation of Chicago Characters, which was the first of Keljiks stories to appear in English. And with generous support from the Keljik family of Minneapolis, St. Paul, Ararat editor Aris Sevag was commissioned to translate the full text of Armenian-American sketches. And it was Aris who also discovered the 8 additional Keljik stories in the journal Baikar. And these were translated by Vartan Matiossian for this English edition of Armenian-American sketches. So what you're seeing here is the cover of the original 1944 edition, as well as the illustration from Ararat. Well, so the late 1990s were a time when the history and culture of Armenian diaspora communities in North America were beginning to receive serious scholarly attention. But Keljiks literary work would not become accessible to English-speaking readers for another 10 years. So as Marc has mentioned, Marc Mamigonian has mentioned, between 2010 and 2012, the National Association for Armenian Studies and Research graciously hosted my lecture introducing Bedros Keljik, and Ararat magazine editor Aris Sevag was also able to publish 7 of the 21 short stories before his untimely passing. So I am really thankful that through Ararat, Keljiks Work at last came to the attention of my friend and colleague, Christopher Atamian, the co-editor of this volume. Bedros Keljik was a keen observer who wrote from life. He often wrote in the first person. Yet his own story was at least as colorful as any of his fictional characters. And by the 1920s, having been at various times an Ottoman prisoner, a Hunchak revolutionary, a factory worker, shopkeeper, literary translator, vaudeville hypnotist, my personal favorite, traveling salesman, law student, and Oriental rug merchant, Keljik at midlife had accumulated plenty of experience from which to draw Armenian-American sketches. Had he pursued literature, this is a quote, had he pursued literature instead of the rug business, he would have become a second Baronian. That's what Keljik says of his fictional merchant, the elderly Hokadarian. And I would say that the same may justly be said of the author himself. Thank you.
Thank you, Luann. Should I start, or how does this work?
Yes, please. We will now go to Christopher Atamian. Chris.
All right. Am I on full screen? You can see me? Okay. So am I good? Just let me know. Yeah. All right. So I can't hear you, Marc, for some reason, but I guess that's okay. So what I wanted to discuss very briefly, I mean, Luann, I knew would do like a kind of more thorough presentation of who Keljik is, and I think Vartan's going to talk probably about his own translations and Baikar. What I wanted to sort of bring out, first of all, I did want to thank 2 more people, which is Anita Ansarian at the HEBU, who provided an original editing grant for me, and Karen Kluman from NAASR Press, who did the actual cover. And the reason I want to mention them is that if you look at what Luann just told you in terms of a genesis of her own participation in editing, I'm going to kind of fill that in. What happened is that I was a writer for Ararat magazine, and I had the pleasure of having Aris Sevag as an editor, who's a wonderful man. He was very brilliant. He was always very open and very helpful, especially to other Armenians. And he said, sure, come on, you write for the Times, come on board, you can write for Arat magazine. And one day I was looking through and I came upon his translations of the Keljik and of Luanne's one short story, I believe, that I also saw on Arat magazine. And I thought, well, this is great, but where are the other 15 or 16? And so this started this long trek at first because Arius unfortunately passed away from cancer. And Anita at VHBU said, well, call Astrid Sevag, who is his widow. And Astrid was very gracious. And one, she did a lot of work to find the actual 15 short stories that were on his computer somewhere. And two, she gave us, the rights to translate the works. And so from there, we had, we had the translations done. We had, or I had rather, some idea of who Keljik was from what I read. But because of, I think, what Marc quoted from my own introduction, we have in the Armenian community a very interesting situation where we have a lot of very talented people, where we have some things that are funded, but I don't really think we have a systematic organization of schools, of universities that really are able, and of a press that is able to mine a program systematically of looking at all the amazing things that we have in terms of writers and painters. So it's kind of piecemeal, which is not the worst thing in the world. It's not the best thing in the world either. And I don't know how on earth I thought of Luanne. I think Luanne and I happened to have dinner in a Georgian restaurant. And I said to her, I'm working on Keljik. And she's like, well, Keljik is from Minnesota. And I happen to be an expert on Keljik. Like, what are the chances, right? And so I brought her on as an editor, knowing that she would have the expertise that I still don't have. And then we had these 8 extra texts. And I know Vartan from having worked on things with him before. And so we brought him on to do the translations from Baikar. But if you put that all together, that's a lot of accidental things that have to go right. You have to have 4 or 5 different people who are translators, writers, editors, and then Marc Mamigonian and Barlow now are involved as both the publisher, because Barlow is amazing and seeing the importance of it right away, and then Marc has an interest in it as well and is hosting us from NAASR. So those are amazing things, but my wish is kind of that we can, which is what I'll take away from this, because I'm not going to talk more about Keljik, and I'll say a couple words about him, but is that we can hopefully in the next generation, if there are people out there listening, really start funding our press, bring back Arat magazine, start funding, more professorships and more publications so that we can, finally, there's Keljik, but there's also Tolgadinsi, and I've never really read Tolgadinsi in English. I don't know if he's been translated. He probably deserves a book to him. Marc's shaking his head because the answer is no, apparently. But it goes on and on. There are people in Armenia today. I'm writing an article for the Spectator, Armenian-American Spectator, on 3 brilliant Armenian writers who've been translated into English by Araviks Ari Publishing, which is it's the first publishing house in Armenia that translates current writers. So that's kind of what I hope. I hope is that by showing people how wonderful these stories are, that it'll also bring a new generation of people on board who are going to help us do more of this type of work. In a very brief note, what I really liked about the short stories is that they are ethnic histories of Armenians in America, but they're American history as well. They write about the Bowery, about a section of Boston. I went to Harvard right outside of Boston and Cambridge. I never knew any of the details about Copley Place and all these other places that he writes about in Boston. And some of the things have been destroyed, and it serves almost as an archaeological dig of the city of Boston, where you can go and read a story and see, oh, this used to be XYZ. So I think it contributes to American history and Armenian history, to ethnic history, to literary history. It's an amazingly rich bunch of stories, and they're absolutely hilarious. There's every possible stereotype you want inside these pieces about Armenians, Jews, Irish people, drunkards, women, men, clergymen. And, they say there's always an ounce of truth to every stereotype, and maybe there is. But and maybe there isn't, but I think there really is. So they're just very funny, well-written stories. I think Iris did, and Luanne on her one translation did a fantastic job of translating them. They read beautifully in English. I kind of cleaned up Iris's original translations because I don't think he ever got to go back to them, unfortunately, because of his untimely death, and do that himself. And then Vartan did a great job on the Baikar. And the Baikar brings in kind of the history of Anatolia and and really Keljik's kind of political involvements and some of his views. So again, I want to thank everyone here. I'm sorry that I'm not being more academic, but I don't think in this context of all these other brains and knowledgeable people that I would really add anything to it. So my takeaway is buy the book, fund NAASR, fund a new Arat magazine, help us to do all these things, and help. There's a whole generation of young Armenians that are amazing everywhere in the world, and I hope they get involved and that we can do more of this. And that's about it. I have nothing else to add, I guess. So who's next, Barlow or?
Christopher, thank you. We will be hearing more from you, I am certain, later, and we will now go
Yeah.
to Vartan Matiossian.
Oh, Vartan. Hey, Vartan. Good.
Thank you. I just wanted to make a few comments about the translation, my involvement, and some assorted matters, sort of. I have to say that I had heard of Bedros Keljik and his book long before Aris Sevak came up with his first translations, and Luan too. But of course, I don't remember where and when I had heard of him. But at that time, I wasn't that much into trying to get a hold of the book or trying to find out more about Keljik. And there's always too much going on. So the conclusion is that never say never, because as you know, at some point I got involved here. I have to say that, first of all, my experience as a translator started in 1980, but my target and my focus at the very first and for many years was Spanish, and to a lesser extent Armenian. If I put aside a few samples that I did while I was still in Argentina in the 90s, my real task started when I moved here in 2000, especially in the last 10 years. I have to say that if Aris Sevak had not untimely passed away in 2012, I'm pretty sure he would have translated the 8 Vicar pieces that I had the honor of translating for this book. But I owe this honor to Chris Atamian for reasons that he knows better than I do. Because I am a relatively newcomer to the English language and an alien on top of it, he thought that I could provide a decent version of what Keljik had written in Armenian. So this was both an easy and a difficult task. As it was mentioned, Bedros Keljik was a student of Telgadinci and a classmate of Rupen Zartarian, both very well-known writers and both victims of the Armenian genocide. As you know, he also translated from Armenian a piece by Zartarian, which has been included in this book. Fortunately, that's why I said it's the easy task. His style followed his teacher's style, which is Telgadinci's style is a crisp and simple style of writing, rather than the ornate and sometimes convoluted style that Zartarian has, which makes it much more difficult to translate for sure. And I'm not sure if Keljik had Zartarian's style, I would have dared to undertake the translation, at least at that time. So that was the easy part, but the difficult part, as anyone who has or is in the business of translation knows, is to how to turn that deceivingly simple text into well-written English text. But I believe that judging from the version that came back after editing, I was able to do something decent and just to justify the trust that had been put on myself. So this was a positive experience, and not only positive, but also enriching. Since the 4 books of various genres I've translated into English in the past 5 years, and the 4th is coming up hopefully this year, Corona willing. So they owe something to that translation in far away in 2015. So these 8 pieces belong to different genres. while they all have an autobiographical strain, some of them have become short stories of their own, while others are valuable memoirs written from the old country about the Gettonagan School of Harpert where Keljik studied, or about the new country, Keljik experience in Boston. On the other hand, Keljik not only became a person of interest because of his colorful life, where you have an interesting glimpse in the Boston recollections and the themes of many of his short stories, but because he also happened to belong to a family of writers. Let us recap. He was the elder brother of another writer, Keljiks Keljik, also known by the pen name or somehow heard by the pen name of K. Devrish. And he was also the maternal uncle of a well-known Western and Eastern Armenian writer, Vahan Totovens. For those of you who have had the chance, you can read Totovens' work in English, thanks to the translations that Misha Kudian did in the 60s and the 70s. So the interesting thing is that Totovens, when Totovens was in America from 1909 to 1915, he was indeed with his family, and he worked with Bedros Keljik at his shop in Minnesota and lived in Minnesota for years. I'm not going to delve that much into that because it's not the subject of this short presentation. But the interesting thing is that by one of those coincidences that Chris mentioned, while I was working on these translations, I was also working, again by chance, on a lengthy paper on Totovens' early biography, which I managed to publish in 2016 in Armenian, in the Haigazian Review in Beirut. And the interesting thing is that thanks to these translations, I took a glance at Keljik pieces in Baikar, and probably I would have missed them if not for the assignment about the translation. And I found lots of pieces of information that were related actually also to Totovens, in the sense that, you know, both belonging to the same family, they have, of course, the same relatives. So that information was valuable to complete some pieces into my own Totovens puzzle. And in the end, I would say that if someone goes to read Totovens' celebrated autobiographical novel, The Life on the Old Roman Road, which was translated published in 1962, you will be able to find more than one reference to Keljiks own folks. So one interesting piece on the side is that we don't know much, or I don't know much about Keljiks Keljik, but I can add something that was first pointed out by Matiossian in English in his monograph on Totovens. And this is that when Totovens in the 1930s was already trapped in Stalinist Armenia, he was, crazily enough, corresponding with his own relatives and old friends in America. I have published some of that correspondence. The one correspondence that Matiossian gave me for publication. And interestingly enough, he corresponded with K. Devrish, and fragments of those letters, very interesting and important letters in different ways, were published by Simon Vratia in 1945, and Matiossian has made reference to them in his monograph. But the actual correspondence, we don't know where it is, basically. I looked into Simon Vratian's own files, both in Boston and in Beirut, but nothing came up. I am tempted to think that maybe those papers are tucked in some corner in Minnesota. I'm just floating the question to see whether some answer will come up. Maybe Luan will have the answer, if not now, in the future. So to to finish, I do believe that this book rescues an early chronicler of the first years of the Armenian-American community, but also contains much more that meets the eye. And I would like to end with a reflection, because we have so many stories written by grandchildren who discover much later who their ancestors were. And as we heard, Marc Keljik actually discovered more than 50 years later, by chance again, that his grandfather had written a book in Armenia in 1944. And while the book could have gone unnoticed to anyone reading in Armenian, whoever, unless he or she was a scholar, this is a piece of data, is a testament to the fact that so many treasures are hidden behind the curtain of language. And it takes so little to open that curtain and uncover so many of those treasures, just to learn a language, like learning, let's say, Mandarin or Spanish. So I wish that people like Ari Sevak, who was born here and spoke and wrote and translated and wrote the Armenian language without having had the benefit of a day school, and others like him who are appearing and popping up here and there, become a multitude. And the treasures of Armenian culture become not available thanks to this or that translator only, but also in their original format, where there is always something intangible that escapes to the best efforts of any of the traitors that are called translators. Thank you.
Vartan, thank you very much. And thank you to each of our speakers for your remarks and for the information conveyed in them. I know we will have some questions, and while they're coming in, I wanted to mention something which I would welcome any of your comments on, but it's something that really Christopher touched upon in his remarks. When he was reflecting on the series of coincidences that were almost required for this project to become a reality. And what I think that points to is a lack of institutionalization, if that's the right word, and a dependence on individual initiatives solely, and the luck of the draw, as it were. The translation of such works is not being done, and the study of these works actually is not being done in an institutional way, so as to continue on a year-by-year basis. Of course, we have many, including Barlow's outstanding Armenian studies programs, where some work is being done on Armenian literature, and of course, but the translation is still being done because one or another individual decides to take it up, or in this case, a couple of individuals pool together to get it done. So my question is, if it's a question, how do we move beyond this to create something that is more sustainable on a year-by-year basis to address some of the gaps that most certainly still exist?
Can I answer that to begin with?
Sure can.
So I'm working on a series of pieces with which I just discussed this morning with Talin Babayan, who's a wonderful writer, and I'm helping her work on a couple of theater and film pieces. I think one, there has to be a consciousness amongst Armenians. First of all, like, cultural work is work, and it's not something frivolous that you do after you've made $1 million as a banker or a carpet salesman, or, I'm not poo-pooing those things, or you can't be a doctor and a translator at the same time, because, they both require 40 hours a week of work, maybe more, right? So that's the first thing. Second of all, if you look, for example, I had a friend who said to me one day, well, I don't understand why people, it's everyone's favorite topic in America, don't know more about the Armenian genocide, but everyone talks about the Holocaust. And I said, well, because the Jews have 40 world-class museums just in America, and, and you go to Harvard or Yale or the University of Indiana, Bloomington, or CUNY, and there's always a Jewish studies program, and they have 3 or 4 professors. So if you take 50 times 4, that's 200 professors who are working full-time. And in America, we're lucky we have, Marc, we had, James Russell, who's not ethnically Armenian, but Marc and Vartan. But you add us all up and it's like 20 people, right? Or 30 people who are working. And I don't even do it full time for all sorts of reasons, which I hope to at some point. So one is that we need to get a recognition that we need financial support. Two, that it's a full-time job. Three, that you need critical mass. I actually think that's what we're missing. Because if you look at Lebanon or Syria, unfortunately, until recently, or Bolis before the genocide, what Armenians had was a critical mass. You had like 15 or 20% of a population, which is what you have in Glendale now anyway. And there you have like UCLA, USC, and Irvine. But we need to do that everywhere. And that's the third thing. And I think something that Vartan I know is very finds important, and I do as well, because I think the Argentine, and I think he's from Uruguay originally, Armenian communities are more modeled on the Middle Eastern model. So I know that, for example, to take the Jewish example again, a lot of Jews don't speak Hebrew, but they still consider themselves Jewish. So you can be Armenian without speaking Armenian, like most people in America. It doesn't make you less or more Armenian. But interestingly enough, I went to a French school and we all learned how to speak French. And a French American who doesn't speak French is not French, right? I mean, they learn French because if they want to say they're French, they want to be able to access the French press, French writing, speak to other French people. And I think that the language is something that we've also lost. So as a translator, that's a little bit ironic because I'd be putting myself out of a job if we all spoke Armenian, except for Americans that want to read it. But I think we need to also not close our schools, as you see happening in a couple of the different, Takayan, AGB, a lot of the organizations have tried to take funds and reallocate them, which I understand. And those are great organizations, and thank God that they're around. But I think we need to be opening Armenian schools, and we need to be opening Armenian schools that are vibrant, that are bicultural, that are bilingual. Because if you look, for example, Avahio Shagan and Hagop Shagan, Serafin, all of our great writers from the diaspora, almost all grew up attending Armenian schools. It's hard. I learned Armenian as an adult, and that's one of the reasons that I don't write my books and my poetry in Armenian, because I'm quasi-fluent as a reader, but I'm not native, right? And there's a difference. So I don't understand the subtleties of writing slang, modern day Armenian slang. So that's kind of, I know it's a long answer, but those are I put them all into one answer there. Does that answer that I think we need more involvement. We need a critical mass. And we also need, I think, to get over something we still have, which is the remnants of a kind of inferiority complex about our own culture, and not realizing that there are Armenian writers before and today that are just as interesting to non-Armenians as, I don't know, Victor Hugo and whoever else you want to mention, James Joyce, Proust. I mean, we have writers like that. We have Indra, we have Serafin. I think most people just don't know. I didn't know about them until recently. It's my friendship with Marc and a couple of other people and Kriko Beledian in Paris, who translated and told me about these people that has put me on that path in life. Otherwise, I never would have known they existed.
Thank you, Christopher. And I would like to address a wrong that I have committed and let Barlow Dermogradician say a few words before we reach.
Well, I was going to say, you cut Barlow off.
That's, I'm sure there's a reason for that. Barlow, please.
Forever, as you know, so you better get him back on here.
Thank you, Marc. I just wanted to say a few years, it was about 3 years ago when Christopher and Luann brought the proposal to publish the book to my attention. And once I had received the proposal, I was able to, read some of the excerpts of the stories, and I was immediately taken by them. I really thought that this is something that I wanted to include in our series, because to me, they ring true as really authentic portraits of the Armenian community of the early 20th century. I live in Fresno. I've studied Saroyan. We've all probably read Saroyan, and we can see some similarities between Keljiks Work and Saroyans. They both bring to life characters long since gone. Keljiks, I think, portrays the often difficult struggles and challenges that the early Armenian settlers went through. Saroyan addresses more of Fresno and the Armenian community, sometimes through the eyes of children, but sometimes also taking on more serious topics. But to me, it's going to be interesting for someone to do more research on this early period in the 20th century, because Keljik was kind of left out of the canon of early 20th century English American Armenian writers writing in English. So there is some more work to be done there. As I mentioned, I felt this was a very valuable work to our series. The name Ari Sevag has come up obviously as the main translator of this work. I want to thank also his wife, Aslig, for also giving us the rights to the book. Thank you, Luann and Christopher and Vartan for your work in translating and also editing. The process of editing was very pleasant. We did a lot of work. We went over it quite meticulously, and I think the product is very worthy of Keljik's original intent in Armenian. And also, you know, Marc and Thomas Keljik's biography is a very important addition to this work. It's called An Armenian Odyssey from the Euphrates to the Mississippi. And I think it really gives context to the work because we really find a deeper meaning in Bedros Keljik's work, as well as Christopher Atamian's foreword and Luann's introduction. So altogether, I think the work came out really good. It's going to be a book that I think will be important to not only the Armenian community. If I were to pick favorites, and it's hard to pick a favorite from this book, there's sort of different themes that run through the work. And if you want to really find out about the Armenian-American community, I think the work I would look at is a work called A Fragment of My Memories, which takes us back through Bedros Keljik's own experience as an immigrant and the difficulties and the challenges that he faced. One of my favorites, personal favorites, is also Love of Church and Sexton Toro, the owner of the church, which tells the story of a man who, in a way, takes over the ownership of the church because he's the caretaker, and without him, the church doesn't even really exist. But I think the one that is most heartfelt and really is illustrative of Keljik's ability to create an idea of what the past was all about was one called Our Garden and My Grandmother. And I want to read just a couple of paragraphs from that, if you'll give me, let me read a little bit of it, because I think it really gives us an idea of Keljik's way of looking at the past and how that was bringing it to us. So it's called Our Garden and My Grandmother. It says, we woke up every morning without dreams and without worries. We refreshed ourselves with the incomparable coolness of the dawn that reached us from the snowy peak of Mount Mostar. And we observed the front garden of our home before sunrise under the silver shining stars of the blue sky. This is how our eyes opened. Many years later, I still live with the indelible memories of those happy days, especially during my summer vacation, when I leave the city for the village, where my home is a cabin with a small window. It is an unpretentious village house surrounded by trees and flowers and the birds singing over them. This was the house where I was born and lived in my homeland during the first 14 years of my life. Now, many years later, I feel what an irreplaceable loss it was when I left it without hope of return. And a little bit later, he says in the same story, the garden had belonged to us for the past 200 years. My ancestors had built the house and cleaned the stones on the downside to the valley, fertilizing the soil in this way. They had built stone stairs leading to the fast-flowing creek of the valley, which would later embrace the waters coming from the Yotnug and the Gotnapyor. My grandmother told the story. I planted this tree 40 years ago in the year when your father was born. Thank God the tree grew with your father. The tree gave plenty of fruit and your father gave me 13 grandchildren. And I planted this apricot tree the year your grandfather went on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem to fulfill an oath. That's just a very brief excerpt of this among many of the stories, which are filled with humor, they're filled with nostalgia, they're filled with, again, the challenges and the stories of enlightening us about the Armenian-American experience. So I think it's really something that all of you would want to read. So thank you also, Marc, for being really the impetus behind today's presentation. And thank you to NAASR also. And by the way, the book is available. The book is available through NAASR. It may say sold out, but actually books are on the way. So definitely the books are available. So make sure that you go to the website and to get that. Thank you, Marc.
Barlow, thank you. And thank you for reminding me that I had skipped you, because
right.
your comments are very insightful and get to a lot of what these stories are about. You know, the stories were written, or at least the stories were published in the 1940s. So they're written from the other side of the Armenian genocide, looking back. And there is a definite sense of what has been lost, not just by the genocide, but by leaving the homeland. And many of the characters are very sad because they left their homeland and gone to this strange new land and had all sorts of problems. Some of them do well here, many of them do not. But it is definitely not we arrived and the streets were paved with gold and everything worked out well for everybody sorts of stories. So one of the questions, and this may be for anyone, but perhaps particularly for Luanne, because I know she has done research on this, is about the collaboration between Bedros Keljik and Alice Stone Blackwell. Could you tell us a little bit more about that, Luanne?
Sure, I'm happy to. So Bedros Keljik, when he was living in the Boston area, was part of an Armenian literary society. And so and Alice Stone Blackwell was also very interested in international humanitarianism. Of course, Alice Stone Blackwell was a great women's suffrage leader, which is great to remember in this centennial year of 2020. But Alice Stone Blackwell and Bedros Keljik met through this Armenian Literary Society, and Alice was also very close to an Armenian divinity student who was studying at Harvard Divinity School. Ohannes Hachumian was his name. So Alice and Ohannes were actually the ones that started translating Armenian poetry and Armenian literature. It was Ohannes that introduced Alice to this literary world. And so it was through Ohannes's friends that she met Bedros and other Armenians as well. So what happened was that two things happened. One was Ohannes Hachumian unfortunately died young, okay? And so Alice was pretty heartbroken about this because, you know, she really loved him. And also the Hamidian massacres broke out around the same time. And so all of these things came together for Alice, where suddenly there was a need to introduce Americans at large to Armenian culture and literature in order to bring to their attention what was going on with Armenians in the Ottoman Empire at that time. So this, what started out as a literary project also became a political project. And so with Ohannes gone, Bedros worked directly with Alice. So he would provide literal translations of Armenian poems of the time, and then Alice would refine those translations into native poetic English, idiomatic English. So there was a correspondence between the two of them. The correspondence is on national, Women's Suffrage Association paper, because Alice was so involved with that then. But so they would send copies, drafts of the poems back and forth. And Bedros kept all of Alice's letters. And at some point while I was working on, researching Bedros's life and researching the history of Armenians in Minnesota, I was quite honored when one day Bedros's son Woodrow rediscovered the original correspondence from Alice Stone Blackwell to Bedros, and he presented those letters to me. I wrote an article about this collaboration, which was published in Ararat Quarterly in 1999. And those letters are now in the Library of Congress, along with a few letters that survive from Bedros that she kept. So that's the collaboration.
Thank you, Luanne. And I wanted to mention again that if anyone has a question, please submit a question through the Q&A Zoom function. I see people who are raising their hands. I wave to you and I acknowledge you, but I cannot do more than that unless you submit a question through the Zoom mechanism. But I do want
Mark, I tried to answer a couple of the questions, but I think I basically deferred to Luann and Barlow on most of them. So I am trying to look at these as well while I talk, which is probably why I look like my face is up to my screen.
Understood. I want to thank the members of the Keljik family who are in the audience tonight, especially, and I know that several are, and there are members of the Keljik family still in the Boston area, some of whom I know, and it's an extraordinary family. And Luann mentioned, Vartan also mentioned Bedros Keljik's brother Krikor, who wrote under the name of K. Devrish, and perhaps someday his works can be translated as well. Certainly another fascinating character. There's no end to it, really. Question for Luann or anyone. Where did Bedros get his early education before he came to the US? And I think we've touched on this.
Sure, I can answer that. So he was a student of the Getronagan school in Harpert, which was located next to the Armenian church in Harpert. And that was the school where Tilgadinsi was the principal. So when you read the book, actually, I'm so glad that my good friend Francis Bulbulian brought this up. One of my very, very favorite stories in this collection is Bedros's recollection of his school days at the Getronagan school. The story has everything. It has humor, it has poignancy, it's his whole reconstruction of a world that by that time was lost, because he was writing the story after the genocide. But his recollection of his school days and how much he would love to return to that world, but he knew that world was gone. And he presents it with such heart and such humor and such poetry. I just can't recommend that story enough. So if you want to know about his schooling, that's the place to look. Thank you.
Yeah, I want to second Luann on that, because I think ideally, if you're studying a writer or a period in time or history, if you combine literature, history, anthropology, as much of a different discipline, social disciplines as you can, you get a very complex picture. And there's an organization, if you guys don't know it, called Hushamadian, which is what it's recollections in Armenian, or is it memoriam? I don't have a proper translation.
Memorial book is basically.
Yeah. So and my friend Silvina Dermogradician, who I had the pleasure of being part of the Armenian Diaspora Pavilion at the Venice Biennale, which was a unique event with a Kurdish and Palestinian artists as well. She's doing a great job there. She didn't start it, but she's kind of the person who's moving it forward with video. I actually think that although when you read, you only get the page, the print, you don't get the visuals that Hushamadian has in the videos, that it's actually almost as evocative. And that's what is amazing about his writing. It is kind of realistic, simple writing, but that particular story, when I read it, I felt like I was actually in the school. And I mean, I always went to a French school where they tend to be like disciplinarians in the same way. So it kind of brought back memories from how some of my teachers used to treat us. But you really feel like you're there. Like you can see the fountain, you can see what Harpert might have looked like. And it's just very brilliantly done. I think it's a talent that is maybe innate to just very good writers. And so I just wanted to add that, yeah, if you're going to read one or two of the stories, like that's definitely one that I would read as well.
Yeah, it's extremely moving. And Tilgadinsi, who has been mentioned now several times, and who we saw in Luann's slide presentation, is a remarkable figure who really does need to be studied and translated. And he was the teacher of both Keljiks, as we've heard, of Todevens, of Hamasteh, of Ruben Zardarian, Benjamin Norigian, Vahe Haig, and other writers.
Yeah, and Marc, how many of those people have been translated into English?
Very, very little. Yeah.
Right.
So there's a whole school of literature, a whole Harpert regional school of literature and its descendants that really awaits proper attention, I think. We have a question about Armenian-American women whose creative or nonfiction writing, including memoirs, might be worthy of similar attention. This gives me, by the way, the opportunity to mention the wonderful work that's being done by the Armenian International Women's Association, which has published in recent years several volumes by Zabel Yasayan, and recently published a translation of Serpui Dusab's novel Maida, which is not Armenian-American, obviously, but is a translation of Armenian important works of Armenian literature by two women writers. It's a huge contribution that they're making. So Armenian-American women writers, any thoughts on that from anyone?
What is the question, though? Whether
I think the question is, I'm interpreting it as if there's any Armenian-American Armenian-American women writers whose work is ripe for discovery that you would like to.
I mean, you know, I can think of a couple, but they're first of all, they write in English, so they're available. And number two, they're contemporary. So I think like Nancy Gabian is a brilliant writer who's also important in her own right, not just because she's Armenian. You know, Voski Avakian wrote Lion Woman, and it was the first feminist American writer by a lesbian. So it's also part of LGBTQ literature, both American and Armenian. Her book should be republished, I think, because it's out of stock. You know, there are all sorts of you know, of people like who right now, I forget her first name, but Barba, she was a brilliant poet who just won the, what is her first name?
Susan Barba. Susan
Barba is a brilliant poet. I don't know who else. I mean, there's a lot, like Alina. Now I'm totally like blanking. There's another poet that I'm actually friends with. How embarrassing. Ari Sevag's daughter, Ida Zalilian's a very good writer. Nancy Krikorian writes novels that a lot of people have read. Dan Dermogradician.
Yeah, Caroline.
Yeah, they're not of. So if a question from the person who asked it is, are there writers from the turn of the century? That I don't know. All these writers are contemporary writers. And I would be surprised if there were women at the turn of the century writing in Armenian in America, but it's possible. I mean, what do I know? Luann, you?
Well, the only thing I would add to that is, I mean, look at all of the coincidences it took to even find Bedros Keljik, right? I mean, if any one of the links in that chain had been broken, we wouldn't be having this conversation. And how much more of, you know, how much more digging do we have to do to uncover the history of Armenian women writers, whether in America or elsewhere? So I am really, really happy that question was brought up, and I thank the questioner.
Right.
If I may add, two numbers that just come from the top of my head, and I don't have a list in my mind anyways. I can remember two actually Iranian Armenian women. One, Mugrdechian, who was writing already in 1940s. I remember at least she had a book published in the 1940s here in the States. And the other one, which it's more well known because she even had a book in English, even though she wrote in Armenian, who was Lucic Melikian, who passed away a few years ago, and she was a writer quite well known in New York, especially in the 70s and 80s after she came from Iran. I can't remember right now anyone, you know, going before the 1940s, at least someone who had a certain production other than, you know, writing occasional pieces. Of course, you have here, after the 1920s, you have Zarwi Kalemkerian, who was from, actually originally from Istanbul, but she moved here in the early 1920s. So she passed, I mean, she spent 50 years of her life here. So somehow she's also an Armenian-American writer in her own way. If we are talking about people born here, you won't find Armenian writing women, at least as far as I can remember. But of course, a list is needed, and it's not that I'm trying to make a list. I'm just trying to give some names, on the go.
Well, I mean, if you're talking about poetry, there's a very good book of poetry out from Yerevan. It's called A History of Armenian Poets, and it goes back literally to the 7th century, to the present time. I don't know how you access it. I have a PDF of it. If anyone wants it, I'm happy to email it to them. And there's also, Lula Kundakjan, who's herself a woman and a poet and an American, has the Armenian Poetry Project. And if you just go down the list of contents of both those books, a lot of the people are women, obviously. And so that's one way of accessing it. I don't know them all by heart right now because I'm also strangely tired on a Sunday when you're supposed to be revitalized. So I can't think of the names, but there are many. Vila Krikorian in Armenia is a female writer who comes here a lot, but I think she would be considered just Armenian-Iranian. So scratch that. But yeah, it's a good question.
I would like to thank Aris Janigyan for clarifying this question and bringing up a very important angle to it. Aris says that he's referring to the early years of settling in America. Okay. And what about diaries? And that's a great question. That really opens it up, right? Diaries and personal letters, right? I mean, that is part of women's literary production, and especially in cases where perhaps women were more in charge of the family correspondence. So, whether or not they published books, it doesn't mean they weren't writing. And so, again, I think there is a lot of digging to be done in everybody's attics and basements and wherever it is the family papers may be, because there may be a lot more hidden treasures, and maybe it's not in the Library of Congress, maybe it's in your basement. So thank you for that question.
And that's an opportunity to make a standard pitch, which is that if you have such materials in your home or in the home of a family member, and you don't know what to do with them, they should be in an institution where they can be looked at, whether that institution is a place like the Armenian Studies program at Fresno, or NAASR, or the Zorab Center in New York City, or elsewhere. They should be accessible to researchers, and they cannot be accessible to researchers, I'm sorry to say, if they are in your closet or basement. Mm-hmm. That's just one of those facts of life. Vartan, excuse me, I cut you off.
No, I just said that probably we need also to make a digging in the Armenian-American newspapers at the turn of the century, let's say at the 30s or 40s, because of course there are women writing there, but of course there are writers that is not just an isolated piece or two of writing, or if there is any name that has been there or its presence in this or that publication for a certain period of time.
We lost you a little bit there, Vartan, but I believe your point is, and it's an important one, that we need to really look closely at newspapers and other periodical publications from the early 20th, late 19th century. There were a multitude of Armenian-American outlets in this period, and most of them have really not been gone through, and certainly not with an eye for looking for women writers. And I strongly suspect you're right, that when those are studied carefully, we will find women writers from that period as well that are also deserving of attention. Well, I want to round things up then and thank all the participants, Barlow and Luann, Christopher and Vartan, for your excellent comments and for your excellent work in making this important, valuable book accessible to all of us. The book can be purchased, I want to add, even if it says it's out of stock, trust me, we're getting more of them, through the NAASR bookstore online, www.naasr.org. I should mention too, since Chris brought it up, that we also have copies of Lion Woman's Legacy, which is an excellent book that also is worth.
Oh, you do have it. Okay,
Marc, if you allow me.
Yes, Vartan.
Yeah. While you restock your books, we also have copies of the book at the Armenian Prelacy book.
Yes, I'm sure that Professor Dermogradician would be happy to sell them to you as well, and to anyone who would like to purchase and distribute them.
No, we have them already.
Oh, you do have them? Then please.
Yes. So I mean that while you restock your copies, we already have them too.
Excellent. So the prelacy, and again, I'm sure most of your finer Armenian book outlets have this book available, and they certainly should if they don't. So once again, I thank you, and I thank the audience for your attention, for your questions and comments, and we will see you next time.
Thank you, Mark.